So with us today, we've Annemarie ní Chuirreáin. Annemarie is a poet from the Dingle Gaeltacht. Her books include Bloodroot, Town, and The Poison Glen, and she's a recipient of many, many awards, including the Arts Council Next Generation Artist Award and lots more. We have Chuirreáin, writer and activist. Chuirreáin has performed in New York, London, Brussels, and Sweden. She's currently an artist in residence with the Dublin Fringe Festival. Her work has been published in journals including Icarus, Aeneas, and Coer, and the recent anthologies Bone and Marrow, Náv agus Smear, obviously Queering the Green, Washing the Windows, and lots more. We also have Seán Hewitt. Seán Hewitt is author of the poetry collection Tongues of Fire, which was awarded the Laurel Prize, and he was shortlisted for numerous awards, including the Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year. He is also a book critic for the Irish Times and teaches modern British and Irish literature at Trinity College. Welcome, guys. Good to have you. So I guess just to kind of start off, it's clear that like a vast amount of work went into this anthology. Just looking at the size of it, I mean, 31 voices, that's incredible. So I suppose it'd be fantastic just to get an idea of what your individual involvement was and what that kind of meant to you as poets.
I mean, Paul Maddern was the editor, so we were dealing with him mostly. Well, I'll let you guys speak for yourselves. But I just sent in a selection of poems, and he picked the ones that he thought would be most suitable for the collection. Mine were in English and Irish. Some of them, I don't think I had an English translation, like I had a rough translation, so I worked on that then for the final book.
Yeah, so Paul edited it, so he just emailed me and asked if he could use some poems from Tongues of Fire. So that is kind of the extent of my involvement in the book. But I guess what's really nice about this book is that there are a good number of poems from each poet in the book. So you get a real sense of the new voice, and you get to really get to know the new writers in the book, rather than just having one poem from each person. So that's nice, and I discovered new poets through reading this book as well, which was lovely.
I was delighted to be included in the book. I have a number of poems from my first collection, Bloodroot, published by Dura Press, and I was just amazed when I received the book by how beautiful it is. It's I think an anthology does a very special kind of work in the world. It creates community, and it creates a conversation between poets and readers, and between poems, to see your poems kind of sitting alongside poems by other writers that you may not yet have read, or you're just getting new exposure to, is kind of a uniquely exciting thing.
Amazing. And I think it's one thing I thought was kind of really remarkable about this anthology is the fact that it's not just poems in English, it's poems in Irish, like Chuirreáin, some of your poems, if not all of them, are in Irish, and you, as you said, translated to English, not the other way around, which is amazing. Is that something you'd like to talk a little bit about, your kind of Irish, your interest in Irish language and your writing true Irish?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I come through, and there's a poem in this anthology, An Bhéal ar Fad, a different animal altogether, where I kind of imagine myself as a fox in the city. So I'm this like thin, gouged-eyed creature that isn't quite what a real fox should look like in the countryside. So that's kind of how I see myself as an Irish speaker, as someone who learned the language later in life. I didn't have Irish growing up. I learned at university mostly. So it's a funny one because I'd be a very different relationship with the language as a writer from the Gaeltacht who has it from birth and would have maybe been writing in the language their whole lives. So for me, it's a choice, and I'll always, in a way it's harder, in a way it's easier because the Irish language isn't as commercialised as English, so things aren't so overdone, I suppose. You can kind of feel like you're doing something fresh in a language that people aren't using for advertising and business and that sort of thing. So it's a nice language to write in. But then when I have to translate it into English, and that can be very difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine, because poetry is, well, it's poetry. It's not just like translating an article or something. You need to get the kind of art across as well. Yeah, I mean, one thing that really strikes me about this book, just picking it up, the cover and the title, like, you've got this fantastic bubblegum pink, which pops out against the screen. And I think what that really, for me, kind of brought to mind was the fact that this isn't just about queer identity, it's queer identity in Ireland. And, Ireland has changed so much over the last 10, 20, 30 years. Maybe a book like this, well, it wouldn't have existed. And I think it's amazing to see it. But, do you have any thoughts about queer identity in kind of the field of poetry as, queer poets in Ireland?
Me personally? Or any of them?
Yes, lots of thoughts, all kind of floating around, free-floating in my brain, just trying to grasp one of them. I suppose that the anthology was an opportunity to reflect upon this question of who my queer foremothers are in Ireland, and to what tradition do I belong. And it was an opportunity to start thinking of my own poems as being an extension, maybe, of the Irish language tradition in particular, I think. I grew up speaking Gaelic and Tógamala Gaelic, and I'm in a different situation to Ciara, because I felt like I kind of had to unlearn it at university to some degree, and start speaking and learning in a second language. But I think that through this anthology, I've had space to think about my mother tongue, and the fact that I actually come from a tradition of writers, specifically female writers, who had kind of access to writing the full kind of range of their life and their emotions and all the different dimensions before the weight of the canon came down upon them as a silencing force. So if you kind of, it's a roundabout way of saying that I think through this anthology, I've had space to think of myself as a queer woman within the Irish language tradition, and that actually that's not as disjointed a connection as it is with the one I have with the English canon. Does that make sense?
No, that is really interesting, and that's something I kind of thought about in a way, because when you sort of see maybe an anthology and it's queering the green, so you kind of imagine this collective voice, but actually one of the fantastic things when you read through this is these voices are so diverse and different. The form of all the different poems is completely varied, and it's incredible how, and it's sort of what might seem like a categorization actually it has the opposite effect. And I don't know if does it feel different when you're actually preparing poems or selecting poems to submit to an anthology like this versus when you're publishing your own collections?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that having poems in this anthology made me conscious of is the question of what makes a queer poem and what makes just a poem. And I guess when they were all in Tongues of Fire, I had never really made the distinction between those things because they were all just poems by me. Whereas when it came to selecting the poems for the anthology, I was kind of aware, did I have to choose 10 overtly queer poems? Like what would that look like?
Sure.
There was another anthology published this year as well called the 100 Queer Poems in the UK. And the editor of that had asked me what I thought was my queerest poem. And I suggested a poem that's called December, and it's about Frost. And I said, I think it's that one. But it doesn't have any like sex in it. So it wasn't actually the one that was chosen. You know, the queerest poem was the one that was most overtly about queer sex or desire. And I guess those questions are still kind of unsettled in my mind, like how do you define a queer poem? I think Paul in the beginning of the anthology, in the introduction, just basically says any poet by a queer person. But that other anthology has different ways of thinking about it. Like it has to queer language in some way, or it has to have, you know, maybe there's certain subject matter or whatever. So yeah, all of those things kind of emerged when taking the poems out of one collection and into the collective of queer poetry, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's quite interesting to kind of think about. And do you guys have any poems that you would like to read from today?
Would you read December?
Yeah, maybe I'll read the queerest poem. So you'll notice it's not really anything queer. It's just called December. It's about December. I imagine winter returning as if woken from a dream, clambering from the iced rabbit hole of the field, open-mouthed, the sound it makes coming home knee-deep in the night, its slow feet, the numb toes. I listen for the pain in the white shins of the birches, splinter trees charred by cold, limbs creaking. What is the sound of winter? Bark dropping wetly beneath the laid-down lace of the snow. And where does it go? To the scales of the fish, which are its sequins, to the frost skin of the pond, where it grows itself, to the branches of the water in which it sits, spinning its own white body.
Yeah, sure. I might read a poem called Sisters, and it's dedicated to the many foster sisters that I grew up, who are kind of a group of girls who taught me a lot about community and adversity and overcoming struggle, and also a lot about silence, actually, which is a subject I'm often interested in my poetry. Sisters. Let it be said, I cut a nick in my own skin, and by a spit became blooded to them all. Maeve swaddled in clean cloth like a gem, as her mother, aged 16, leaned against the kitchen counter and watched me hold. Breege and Marie, found in a trailer by the river, speaking in a twisted song. Emer, who was always going home. Niamh, who I was wild for and who was wild for me, but who held me under in the pool until both of us were dragged out of the water sobbing. Dara, who pulled her shirt up to reveal a string of roses on her ribs. Here are the gifts of my father, she said. Grace, who could fix any error with a piece of purple gum. Sarah, pure as water, bold as fire. I can still see her tear across the hill on that guy's motorbike, high-headed and ready for battle. Tailed women, denim stealers, alley girls in white musk with 9 lives, these were my sisters. We argued over top bunks. We bled on sheets. We were 4 in a room the winter the house was falling down. We wrote letters to the man on the radio. We scanned the news for names of the dead. We curled letters inside bottles and threw them out to sea. We snapped wishbones, swore on graves, buried our treasure. We swung the gold of our mothers over our palms 3 times and asked the air, will I be loved? Yes or no? Yes or no? Yes or no?
So I'm not sure which one to read now. The queerest poem or the one I just mentioned already? I'll read Annemarie ar fad. Immerge. Is misha an shonach erbach, gibbelach, lagrabelach, einsúlach. Is intach le winter na carrach, splecha amal. Miau rúdóibh gur aundum fós, da nóin nó da nanóin. Is misha an shonach erbach, quiviach im a valja hain. Is muerga maská, I vad sa chrón trá. Ach a gonger, ní lonum ach inshin cheang de scéal me hinshir sach. Scríbum fuilach kebab ó na chlúdach le mo chrúba. Élium ó bhfuil glústán de rúher. Curor is mé a tort ruúd fui chrankach. Blasham rin folla an dúchis me cheanga. An sin Thomas Shellig fui hollis galí in ngurt fair, gan chancrít oer na sailse serga. Dúche nach vaca mé chuithe. Nar bhrála a bheith I me chionach ceart túche, lonrach, dosach, javahach.
Thanks so much for those beautiful readings, guys. Something that kind of keeps coming up that I'm just interested in hearing more about, you talk about like the queer voice, but then queer subject matter. And obviously there's a difference, because a queer voice is just a voice. And it's not the same, like queer subject matter is a very different thing. So I suppose kind of going forward with your own individual kind of poetry, do you feel more of a drive to just continue writing in your own voice? Or do you, which is a queer voice, or do you feel like you feel you do actually want to delve into the subject matter? Like, do you feel like it's important to produce subject matter, like to maybe educate? Like, again, I think of the title Queering the Green, and there's a sense that maybe, there's a kind of a need to bring the subject and make people maybe more aware or educate. Do you kind of feel a duty as poets to educate or to kind of spread an awareness, or do you feel like, no, like that would kind of interfere with your personal process?
I've been thinking about the work of Leland Bardwell recently because we were celebrating her last weekend in Sligo. It's her centenary, and she had this lovely saying, poetry is not ambition, it's condition. And it's also, I would kind of add to that kind of obsession. And so I'm probably only ever thinking about discovery when I enter into the poem and trying to spend time with my obsessions. And, it sometimes happens that those obsessions are of interest to other people, or the poem that I'm writing might shine at a specific time in history or shine against the backdrop of specific kind of social and cultural events. But I suppose I'm always just trying to spend time with my own interior voice and to understand my own psyche. And my own obsession is trying to understand how my family story fits into the bigger story of things like mother and child separation in Ireland and the culture around that. But they're deeply personal poems. And so I'm a terrible queer poet, because I think of all my poems as being a bit queer, and they're all queering the page. And Paul Madarin talks beautifully about, poetry is a queering of space, always. And I suppose I'm interested in a lot of the themes that come up when we think about queer poetry, which is the body and space and community and power structures and how all of things, history and landscape and the self intersect. But I'm probably not writing explicitly about my queer experience in a way that maybe is sometimes expected. And maybe we have that expectation of poets that they need to be writing specifically about something they're living with or going through. But maybe that's not the life that you're trying to figure out. Maybe that part is figured out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of putting it. In some ways, that expectation makes me more likely to refuse. So I would like, in some ways, when someone wants a poem that is written for a purpose, kind of a social purpose or something, I can't write it because if I know what the poem is about before I start it, then I just write a piece of sloganeering. You know, it's not worth my writing it. I think in an ideal world, a queer poet would be able to write with the breadth of subject matter that any other poet would do. So I don't really see the need to kind of confine it, as in, you know, if a straight poet wrote about space, or about cricket or something, like you wouldn't be questioning whether it was, well, maybe with cricket, whether it was a straight poem. But you know, I think the need to kind of bring an identity to a poem at every point, it doesn't really get to the heart of what a poem can do, because you're not always speaking with this conscious voice that is coming from a place of logic or reason or something. You know, you write something down and you begin to figure out what it is as you go, and it takes on a form. And sometimes when you read a poem back, you don't even recognize yourself in it, or you don't recognize the person who wrote it. So I think it's a much more complex relationship between the speaking voice of the poem and the person who writes it. But it's strange how things are received as well. I think, you know, as Annemarie said, there are poems that or books that appear to be queer when they're attached to a certain person, but maybe in another context wouldn't appear queer. So I do wonder sometimes if the poem is inherently queer, or if it's the context of it. There is in Tongues of Fire a set of versions of the Sweeney story, and when put into the context of the other poems in the book, they kind of queer the Sweeney story. But if you took them out, they wouldn't necessarily do that. You know, so sometimes it's kind of context as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. And do you have a similar kind of experience with that, or?
I think I have a different experience actually, which is
Okay.
because I think you were talking about writing for a purpose, and because I write spoken word a lot of the time, it's very like social justice. You're like, this is what I'm trying to say. This is what I want you to know. Like literally, there's a poem that I wrote. So I run a queer arts collective called Éireach Atach Gaelach. Myself and my co-vado, Owen McAvoy, just realized it was kind of after you were saying this book couldn't exist before 10 years ago, maybe. Yeah, after 2015. We suddenly, well, because of 2015, I met so many Irish speakers who were queer, and it was just like, you, like that Spider-Man meme, like, you're queer? Like, wow, we were all queer. So we started organizing Broad events, and then like Pride events during June, and then we started thinking like, there's this triangle of, there's like artists, people who speak Irish, and queer people, and like there's just so many that have all three. So we wanted to create a group where we could all come together and do something cohesively together. So we set up this arts collective, and now we've over 70 members, not only in Ireland, but around the world. And we're still working on why is it that so many queer people are attracted to, because obviously there are a lot of queer people who want to express themselves through art because they feel different or on the margins, but then that are attracted to the Irish language as well. It's very interesting. But I had to write a poem during the lockdowns. We did a project with the Abbey, and then they had that like Dear Ireland series that came out on YouTube. So it was literally, you have 3 minutes to speak to Ireland. What do you want them to know? So I had to write. So yeah, it's very like, I suppose it's really just laying out we spoke as a group, and we kind of marked out what we wanted to say, and then I went and wrote the poem. And I took bits as well from another poem written by Sam O'Farrick, one of the members in the collective, who wrote an incredible poem called Misha Éireach. If anyone is interested, it's on YouTube, and it's just really beautiful. He's tracing the history of Irish speakers in Ireland, you know, and he's saying, like, "Vi me aun the mask na nini arhasnig drehit talun ata anish pui hin." Like, I was there, and the people who crossed the land bridge that is now under wave, like, there was always queer people in Ireland, and just when people try and make out that it's this edgy and new cool thing to be queer, it's like, no, it's as ancient as the country. But yeah, so with that, I was really addressing people and telling them how to feel, I suppose, or how we feel. So yeah, definitely with that one, but with other poems, I wouldn't feel so much. It does kind of annoy me that people would say often that I'm like, I write about the female experience, you know, whereas like Bob Dylan just writes about life. But you know, I have to be a female. But on the other hand, it is true. I do write about the female experience, and in the world of literature, when that is heard less often, maybe it is important to highlight that and say, okay, she is a queer woman who writes about the female experience, because that would attract me to another writer. So in ways, it's important to mark yourself as what you are, but in other ways, like, I am a human and just writing about my life.
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes sense. And I think it's kind of interesting what you're saying, how a lot of poets are attracted to the Irish language at the moment, because I was thinking, well, I suppose even a word like queer, like, which is a great word and it's been reclaimed, but at the same time, there's a lot of language that can simultaneously be liberating and maybe the opposite. It can kind of put people in categories. And what I would love to know, because I'm not a native Irish speaker at all, but is there, like, what is the language? I mean, the Irish language it's an old language, so I'm guessing it doesn't have so many kind of defining words for people in the LGBTQ community. Does that maybe give a sense of freedom, you know, or does it kind of allow people to evade kind of categorization, or do you have any kind of thoughts on that? I'm curious.
I didn't want to put you on the spot earlier. I was like, other Gaeltacht speakers.
Yeah, I love what Ciara said about queer writers being attracted to the Irish language, and I think the work that you do with the collective is so important. Ciara was at we had the first Broad na Gaeltacht, the Irish Language Pride, in northwest Donegal a few months ago, and it was such a special gathering. And you know, we had our pride parade, like the flag was Lugh, the god of light, who is such a symbol of pre-Christian Ireland. And there was a sense with the traditional music and everything being in Irish that we were connecting ourselves back into a world that was pre the Catholic Church, pre-shame, you know, what was done explicitly to queer people. And it was like a lovely kind of sense of reconnection and being rerouted again, I suppose. And, you know, I suppose in a way, like, because I grew up speaking Irish, you would have a better knowledge, maybe having learned it at a certain time, of the currency of individual words. You know, it's like I haven't analysed my Gaelic, but I do know that there's a way of speaking about community in Gaelic that is very fluid. Okay. You know, like when you ask someone in you know, Irish, you know, who's your family, it's Kalishu, who are you with, you know, and even the word Chaula, you know, it means everyone in your household, not everyone to whom you are blood related. And even we have a lovely common kind of greeting in Donegal Irish, well a chalia, which means, you know, hello pagan witch. So, you know, so there's a kind of a natural space there for diversity and for different kinds of relationships that are not purely defined by marriage or by blood or by, you know, so I feel like I grew up with a kind of a special knowledge that language was a place for diversity. I don't know, does that chime with your experience of the language?
Yeah. Definitely, it's so different when you go down to the Gaeltacht, and, you know, we've learned all these words or invented them sometimes. Actually, there was a launch of An Folklore Atach, so a queer dictionary was just launched on Friday in Galway. They had a version a few years ago, and they're after updating it because, of course, as we learn more about sexuality and identities, more words are coming in, and we want to have words in Irish that answer to the ones in English. But a lot of the time, it's definitely under the influence. You know, we need to have something that's what they use on RuPaul's Drag Race or like something similar. But there is space for creativity and to be careful about the words we pick and to make sure that they are either neutral or positive.
Yeah, no.
I mean, language is evolving all the time. Our English is evolving all the time, and the new queer dictionary adds to an already kind of very rich heritage of words to describe community and body and the self and the queer self. So it's the queer dictionary is kind of adding to that, I suppose. It's gathering and adding.
I guess one thing I'll add to this is that books like this, it's easy in a way for writers like me to sit here now and say I'm not writing queer poems, or I am, but not all the time or whatever. But the books like that come out of activism, and they wouldn't really exist without them. So I think even writers like me have to acknowledge that space is opened up by writers like Ciara. We all live in a ecosystem of these things. I was poet in residence at the Irish Queer Archive last year, and what was mad looking at, there are hundreds of thousands of documents in there, and they start in the mid-70s and go all the way through to now, and there are magazines, publications, and actually the vibrancy of the queer publishing scene in Ireland in the 80s was way surpasses what we have now.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But the longevity of it wasn't secured. So I think there's that space that, like, progress in making space isn't always linear. And actually the shutting down of small community groups in Dublin, the cost of housing pushed people out, the lack of support, emigration, loads of factors went into a decline of spaces for queer work. I was amazed looking at boxes and boxes of magazines and the amount of voluntary work and effort that went into making those spaces. And I think that a book like Queering the Green is another chance to try and hold that space open. And the nice thing about it being a physical anthology that will go on bookshelves and be used in classrooms or whatever, is that you hold that space for longer and it has longevity then. In summary, the work of activists goes into holding a space in which queer poetry can exist in all multiple forms. And so there's a lovely kind of community in terms of how we hold space for each other and what we allow each other to do, or how we support each other's work.
And kind of within that, like, would you find as individuals or as contributors to this anthology that you would have ambitions in terms of, where, like, who will get to access, the space, and who will even just get to access this book and this poetry? Like, for example, as you were kind of talking about, I was thinking, for like poems on the Leaving Cert syllabus, that type of thing. Like, would you have ambitions for the reach of your poetry, encouraging younger poets going forward and that sort of thing?
I think we all, we're all involved in some ways in making space for, like, making space for younger writers or mentoring them and doing workshops and those sorts of things. Do you want to be on the Leaving Cert? Are you? Have you been?
No, I don't know. What are ambitions for the book? I suppose that it brings readers together in conversation, and that this book also extends the readership for individual writers. Yeah. And like, I have a busy practice across lots of different parts of the community. I'm working in prisons one day, and I'm working in universities another, and I kind of, feel that poetry has a role to play in every part of society.
Yeah.
And it's the wonderful thing about being part of an Irish community is that we have a very kind of holistic approach to poetry. I mean, everyone, doesn't matter where you go, has a favourite poem or poet. And I feel passionate that those spaces for different types of poets, to have cross-generation. I mean, I'm just talking about the Leland Bardwell weekend, how lovely it was to be around poets who are older than me and more experienced, and to be in a cross-generational space. So I'm really passionate about extending and deepening that tradition, because I think that's a very, that can only be a good thing for society.
Of course. Yeah.
The nice thing about an anthology as well is, so I now teach this book, or with this book, which means that in the past I may have had to choose, a collection or two by an Irish writer, because I can't get the students to buy 10 books for one class. But now I can suggest that everyone has a copy of Queering the Green, and they can work their way through it, and they can find new poems, and they can find one that speaks specifically to them. So there's a bit of an agency given back to the students as well there. But I think that is a nice thing that an anthology can do, is that it can be this, a text that will be read by many more people usually than one collection would be read, that it has a breadth to it, because you've got 10 people selling power in one book, or 30, how many people are in that, 31?
31.
31 people selling power in one book. So, you all are then introduced to each other's readers as well, so it kind of broadens you out like that. So yeah, I don't know if you ever have ambitions for a poem or poems in that way.
Sure.
We're getting ahead of ourselves, but yeah.
It's interesting what you said about the intergenerational aspect, which is really important. I do feel connected with the writers in this book, and I do feel as though it's important to remember that we're on a continuum, and so often queer history is erased, and it's hard to see. So it is nice to see, at this point of time, there were these writers living in Ireland actively writing, and we happen to all be queer. And I'm sure that's important. I get Instagram messages from young writers saying that they're interested in writing, and the fact that I'm a woman or that I'm queer made them realize that they could do it too. So there is just the representation element of it, definitely.
Of course. And I think it was really actually interesting what you were saying, Annemarie, earlier about the fact that there was a space previously, and you said it even again with the 80s, sometimes these spaces open and sort of close a little bit, and you kind of have to keep pushing through. But in terms of kind of pre-Christian Ireland and the kind of, say, the pagan space or something where it wasn't so limited, do you ever feel kind of compelled to explore a little bit more and kind of maybe educate people a little bit about that space, or bring it into your, maybe you already do, but to kind of, just bring it into your poetry, write more about it. Just...
I don't know that I'd be a terrible educator. I don't know that I can educate anyone, but I'm really interested in that return to an Ireland older than the Catholic Church, and to the rituals and the magic and the folklore, and to that landscape as a kind of, antidote, or even, just a medicine for myself that I can turn to. And it's almost inevitable, all of the kind of poems that I've written about institutions and mother and baby homes, that actually I would kind of turn back to that particular landscape to look at, what it was like before the institution. Now, I'm expert of nothing, I just kind of, gather up my shiny things that I'm interested in and put them into a poem. But I think there's an appetite for that at the moment. And I just remember one of the first festivals that I went to after the lockdowns was the Doolin Festival in Clare, and it had a whole pagan theme to it, and there was a pagan poetry mass, and there was a real feeling coming out of lockdowns and COVID and people, having had time to think about where we are culturally, it was almost like the gates open and everyone came out hungry for that rich pre-Christian pagan stuff. And so I don't know if it's just me and that's where my interests are at the moment, but it feels like it's in the ether, and I'm wanting to connect with powerful female archetypes in Ireland.
Yeah.
And when the influence of the Catholic Church is kind of falling away, like, what do we have to look to? And actually we do have a language in this country that's very feminist. We have a language that celebrates women, fertility, and the female archetype, and it's Irish. And that's a portal, which is why I feel the work that Ciara does and other Irish language poets do is so important. That's a window back into a place where maybe I, as a queer writer, can be myself, where we can all be more of ourselves.
That's incredible. I really want to learn Irish now. But I'm just, I suppose, as we kind of are coming close now, but I'd love to know what projects, I guess, you're sort of working on at the moment and what you're all sort of excited about and looking forward to your work.
I'm working on my first collection,
Oh, wow.
that's exciting.
That is exciting.
What else am I working on? I'm working on a short film set in the next peninsula, actually. But I won the Fisheen, it's a short film award in Dingle, to make this short film. So it's about two women about 100 years ago, and who are attracted to each other. So I'm really excited about working on that. It's my first short film. And a few other projects. I just can never think about them when I'm doing it. What I'm doing. Does anyone else get that?
Yeah,
Yeah. But the collection's taking a lot of the time.
I have a new collection that I have to hand in January. So that is nearly done. And I've been working for the past year or 18 months with an artist called Luke Edward Hall. And I have written new versions of queer Greek and Latin myths and histories and poems and things like this. So there is a big book coming out next summer, which is a collaboration between me and Luke. Luke is illustrating the book it's with Penguin, it's called 300,000 Kisses. So that is out next summer and is pretty much done. So,
That's very exciting.
I'm mostly trying to hang on to my marbles, on a day-to-day basis. I am working again with the composer, Michael Gallen. I'd previously helped to write an opera libretto, and so we have another project coming up. And I don't want to say too much about it, but we spent a week in Monaghan interviewing folk healers about how they inherited cures and about that whole world of that I didn't even know really existed so vibrantly in parts of rural Ireland, but the world of cures and curing and ailments and all things kind of magic.
Amazing. That's really exciting, guys. Looking forward to seeing how these projects come together. But I just wanted to give the audience a chance to ask questions. So I believe we have a microphone going around. Do we? You have a question?
Well, it's not a question, but I'd love to hear voices. I'd love to hear Seán's maybe swinging straight.
okay, a request.
Or something from Annemarie again.
Okay. Do you want a queer one or a not queer one? Well, there's a couple. Where will I read? I'll just read. So this is after Sivner comes. So he meets a man in Britain who's also kind of a man of the woods, and they kind of spend a year together, and they both have a curse that means that they know how they're going to die, and Fair Keller will be crushed by a waterfall, and Shivna will be pierced in the side with a spear. I'll read a poem which comes just after Shivna is pierced in the side, and so he's been living out away from the world for a couple of years, and he's kind of naked, and he's been surviving on watercress. So this is his last words, which aren't really a translation. I kind of made them up. Shivna is wounded and confesses. There was a time when I thought the sound of a dove cooing and flitting over a pond was sweeter than the voices of friends. There was a time when I preferred the blackbird and the boom of a stag belling in a storm. I used to think that the chanting of the mountain grouse at dawn had more music than your voice, but things are different now. Still, it would be hard to say I wouldn't rather live above the bright lake and eat watercress in the wood and be away from sorrow.
Okay, I'm going to read a new poem. I'll just read the Irish. Sorry, I'm trying not to cough into the mic. So this is called An Teanga Bhairibh Seo, and I suppose it's about assumptions about the Irish language. So, Plushamid, Imweave, Gur Teanga Bhairibh. Okay, I'm just going to cough and get that over with. Sorry, everyone. Plushamid, Imweave, Gur Teanga Bhairibh. Is cum a lum sa riach. Fwac, a higgin na glagarí, fwy na hamantí is bio da míon eki. Seo hí, is mé a pór seáil im a stór focail, ma chrí dhíhil tacht an ggursaíos cuí don nasc, ceangal, sníam, seo adring. Seo hí, is tusa I géin ag cogarníal hí a etlíonn an air faoi chuim na hí, tríd a gléas, hig mo chlúas, a bhuí le dríocht. Seo hí, cuire, is mé roit mo glúnta, in óstán galanta lór cathrach. Seo hí, an teanga bhairibh seo, ag dúirta as de bhéal is tú I mo bhéalsa. Seo hí, an teanga a lí, an teanga seo a chuim líon mo bhrilín. Seo hí, seo hí, seo hí a ríis, an tishil garamach, garamert, garamert, garamert.
A few years ago, I was in residency at the Jack Kerouac House in Florida, and I just fell in love with the landscape there, the wild landscape in around Orlando. And my partner Neve came to visit, and we took a trip down St. John's River. And the poem is for her, and it references the old Seminole tribe who used to live around Orlando. Florida Wedding. As a symbol of commitment, I give you an island built by hand for the Seminole dead, where now among the plots a band of horses gleams, each horse shining, each horse meaning stone. I give you a clack-jawed gator slipping off a glade, as from the cypress trees white birds scatter, like a lottery of papers thrown up into the air outside a church. But the church is this, the occasional sound of an unstill bough, or an echoed bray, or an oar lapping water over water, before the river declares, finally, you may swim.
Does anybody else have anything?
I just wonder, do you have a favourite queer, is there a favourite queer book, so-called queer poem, or that poem that expresses your experience in a sort of evocative way. Think of like, I don't know, like even Wood Whitman's Some of Myself, or even some of Shakespeare's Homoerotic, or Elizabeth Bishop Burns, or anything like that.
Oh, sorry, are you speaking to Annemarie?
Anyone.
And the Colette Price one, she's driving. Is that called Driving? Is that in this collection, actually? I think it might be. But she's in the car and she's driving and she's saying how it reminds her of her father. It reminds them both of their fathers, and they're kissing in a car wash, because it's still kind of scandalous to be kissing as two women, you know. But it's just, I mean, I love Colette Price's poetry, but that one in particular came to mind.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a favourite, but I'll just tell you the one I thought of, which was Mark Doty's Ciara. I don't know if you know that poem, which ends with so it's a funeral of someone who has died of AIDS, and someone overhears someone saying that he asked for it, but then it has a list of all the like beautiful things about the world, and it ends with what could he do? What could any of us do but ask for it? Which I really love. So yeah.
I pick one. Probably Elizabeth Bishop's The Shampoo, in which she kind of pays attention to the silver streaks in the hair of her lover and compares them to the moon. It's a really beautiful short poem, very tender. And then I'm also spending time with the poetry of Piers Hutchinson at the moment, and he has some lovely poems kind of buried in there in his body of work. One in particular, I can't remember the name of it, but he's clasping his lover on a motorbike and they're going through Phoenix Park, and it's just beautiful, yeah.